right. We are going to get started because we like to be timely, but we'll have more people joining us, and our wonderful tech people will let them into the webinar. So, my name is Mary Beth Gassman. I'm really excited to be here today. This is another wonderful book talk in our Proctor Institute book series, which we've been very, very excited about. This event is sponsored by the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice, three things that we firmly believe in. And the title of today's talk is Learning from Get Involved, Stories of Bahamian Civil Society. And I am very excited to introduce to you Kim Williams-Pulfer, who is an independent scholar, which I like to hear. I love when we have independent scholars. She also is the principal consultant of KWP Research Strategies, which is a research consulting firm focused on community development, the arts, public humanities, and nonprofit and philanthropic management. Those are all such important things, especially in this world we're living in. So Kim has worked as a researcher, an educator, a community-based advisor for over a decade. She earned a PhD in philanthropic studies with a minor in Caribbean studies at the Indiana Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which I love because a long, long time ago, I took a few classes there when I was doing my PhD at Indiana University. So from 2023 to 2024, she was an American Council of Learned Societies Fellow. And from 2022 to 2023, she was also a American Council of Learned Societies Leading Edge Fellow. And her research has been published in a lot of different academic journals, edited volumes, and also some popular forums, which I think is great. Kim's research and her teaching interests are also very reflective of her personal journey, which I think you're going to see in this talk. Growing up in the Bahamas among community leaders, she was inspired to reconsider how identity, history, and its legacies shape philanthropy and civil society. So I'm really excited to have Kim with us. I just want you to know, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We would love to have a robust dialogue with Kim at the end of her presentation, and I will be leading that by asking her your questions. So please put them in the chat. And as we're going along, we're also going to put a link for the book and also a discount code for the book. So Kim, take us away. We're really excited to have you with us today.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Gassman. Thanks to everyone in attendance. I see a lot of friends and some new friends in the room. So I'm so happy that you've taken the time to spend your hour with us today. Thanks again to Dr. Gassman and her team, Giselle and Jacinda and others at the Proctor Institute who've worked to make this event a reality. And it's a pleasure and privilege to be able to talk to you about my book, Get Involved, Stories of Bahamian Civil Society, which was published in 2024 by Rutgers University Press as a part of their Critical Caribbean series. Next slide, please. So here's the overview for the presentation. My goal in this presentation is to provide a brief tour of the book. First, I'll talk about the focus of the book and the impetus for why I wrote it. I'll discuss some of the theories and concepts that shape the work, and then some of the research methods that I used. I'll conclude with what we can learn from the study or the findings, and briefly discuss why I believe that the work matters or its broader implications. We'll conclude with the whole presentation with your questions. So please feel free to enter your questions as they arise throughout the presentation so that Mary Beth can share those when we get to the Q&A portion. So let's get started. Next slide, please. So the book is based on my dissertation. And once I completed that dissertation work, I continued to evolve my thinking around a few key ideas and questions. Questions like, how do we understand terms like philanthropy and civil society? How does our current understanding of these terms speak to the universal human experience? How is our awareness of philanthropy limited because of popular conceptions that narrow the definition, especially for only those who have extraordinary wealth? What are some of the critiques of philanthropy, especially when we only see it through that lens of monetary wealth redistribution? And are there other ways that we can understand the universal philanthropic experience? How does the dominant narrative of philanthropy marginalize other stories? And what are those stories and experiences that are underdocumented? What can they tell us about how philanthropy operates and the important role that civil society plays in democracy and for citizenship? I also wrote the book contemplating my own personal experiences with philanthropy and civil society that often didn't show up in dominant research narratives while I was a doctoral student. And I wanted to focus on the Caribbean. Um, Wait a minute, I think we need to, okay, great. I wanted to focus on the Caribbean, not only because it's a region near and dear to me, but also because I was intrigued by the diversity of the region and the potential stories that it could provide related to the shape of philanthropy and civil society. The historian and geographer David Lowenthal describes the Caribbean as a place of, quote, a wild and bewildering diversity, end quote. And I believe he describes it in this way because of the region's long history of colonial and imperial extraction, with many colonizing forces across the region. The Caribbean is also the place of very important revolutions, moments of upheaval, resistance, and resilience. And I wanted to think broadly about the Caribbean and eventually refine my work to consider how my place of birth, the nation of the Bahamas, is but one place that can help us to think about these concepts of philanthropy and civil society. So, in working through my methods and developing my analysis, I was drawn to those practices underdocumented and realized in dominant literature. As I dug in, I began to unearth repertoires and practices that I describe in the book as philanthropy from below. My methodology, which I'll talk about a little later, focused on narrative methods, which is simply a method that helps us to understand how stories help us understand experiences of ourselves, our communities, and cultures. And I use narrative methods to look at three key areas: historical narratives, art narratives, and lived experience narratives, which we will get to shortly. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the approaches, concepts that I use to shape the book. There are a few definitions of philanthropy and civil society that were relevant in shaping how I approached the study. Michael Walzer provides us with a definition of civil society as the space of uncoerced human association and also the set of relational networks formed for the sake of family, faith, interest, and ideology. Michael Moody and Robert Payton have a definition of philanthropy as voluntary action for the public good. And they also say that expressions of philanthropy are culturally situated, and within each culture show how people exercise their moral imaginations. When thinking about the relationship between philanthropy and civil society, Bruce Sievers argues that philanthropy is the vehicle that animates the space of civil society. So philanthropy is the practice, and civil society is the place and the space where it occurs. Global sociologist Gianpaolo Bacchi says that we have to do some theoretical stretching to understand civil society within the global south. And he's arguing here that our understanding is limited when it comes to understanding experience of civil society and what we call the global south, because most of the studies focus on the countries of the global north. And when he says theoretical stretching, he's suggesting that we need to use creativity and openness to understand those experiences underdocumented in some of these ideas that we have about civil society. Finally, Margaret Summers argues that when we are taking a look at civil society, we're really thinking about citizenship, right? Civil society is the place where citizenship is actually occurring. Next slide, please. Another set of important concepts I used focused on cultural identity and social identity. And there are many scholars that talk about this idea of cultural identity. And I particularly appreciate Stuart Hall's definition. So Hall says that cultural identity occurs when a group of people have a shared sense of history and experience. And this shared sense of history and experience produces a sense of belonging and connection between a group. And I suggest that when we consider the history of the Caribbean, this shared cultural identity requires us to consider the histories of enslavement, the impact of colonialism, and the many social and political events that emanate from these histories. As a result, these historical formations within the Caribbean, we should pay attention to race, class, and gender as a part of our understanding of the region. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview of the geographic space of the Caribbean: 30 territories, including 13 independent nations, as well as dependent areas and subsidiary states. Next slide. The Bahamas is one of those independent nations in the Caribbean. It's an archipelago of 700 islands and keys. I always loved being able to tell people that when I was studying in the US. 30 of those are inhabited. Proximity to United States, Cuba, and Haiti. The original people, the Taino indigenous people who later experienced genocide. The Bahamas eventually becomes a British colony, participates, like much of the Caribbean, within the slave trade, as well as emancipation, became independent in 1973. Its major industries include tourism and offshore finance, oftentimes touted as one of the richest in the region. Post-independence, which occurred in 1973, you see a growing middle class, but at the same time, also issues related to rising inequality, as well as other social and environmental challenges. Next slide, please. I also wanted to study and think about the dominant and not so dominant ideas about the Caribbean. And here I want to describe two competing ways that the Caribbean is seen or understood. These are not the only ways, but they're two that really take our popular attention, and how we understand the space. So first, we have here Frank Fonda Taylor in his book To Hell with Paradise. It's a book that describes the rise of the tourist industry in Jamaica, which I think can be broadly applied to much of the Caribbean. He says, quote, "Here, according to the brochures, was Eden resurrected, an island world devoid of blizzards or snow, of worry or hurry. Here was a province of pleasure, leisure, laughter, and love everywhere." Taylor describes the view of the Caribbean as a touristic paradise, right? A place for relaxation, an out-of-time experience for those who visit. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, here's another view from author Jamaica Kincaid in her work, A Small Place. She says, eventually the masters left in a kind of way. Eventually the slaves were free in a kind of way. The people in Antigua, and she's specifically referencing the people in the country of Antigua. Now, the people who really think of themselves as Antiguans, and the people who would immediately come to your mind when you think about what Antiguans might be like. I mean, supposing you were to think about it, are the descendants of those noble and exalted people, the slaves. So in this depiction of the Caribbean, Kincaid describes Antigua, and by extension, the Caribbean, with a reference to its history of enslavement and conquest. The quote also identifies ongoing patterns of inequality, but also sources of resistance and community vitality. Which visions of the Caribbean are you most familiar with? Next slide, please. So my work focuses on those people, some of whom are described by Kincaid and who I argue are decentered in conversations about philanthropy and civil society. Caribbean historian Hilary Beckles notes that the people of the Caribbean continue to be trapped in colonial relationships. While I agree that this is true, in the book, I wanted to think about how, despite this kind of marginalization in the global system, formerly colonized and enslaved people continue to resist, create, and counter those challenges. Through the book, I was able to identify how these people continue to develop repertoires and practices, and in many ways have successfully upset many social hierarchies that have limited their opportunities. And as I mentioned earlier, the book orients itself under a theme and lens of what I call philanthropy from below. Philanthropy from below recognizes how enslaved people and their descendants in the Caribbean and elsewhere develop practices of living and responding within the space of civil society, as they were animated by philanthropic practices, with a sense of agency and empowerment for the purpose of their survival and advancement. And as a researcher, when you create a concept or a term, you try to operationalize it and you try to fully understand how it exists within a particular place. And so usually what you have to do is think about what your research methods are. And so for my research methods, next slide, please. I focused on narrative methods. And when we say narratives, we're simply saying narratives are stories, and they're the stories that we tell ourselves and each other and use to make sense of our world and our experiences. I think we all know that narratives can justify and dehumanize. Narratives can also heal and correspondingly or alternatively humanize. Now, scholars across various disciplines use narrative research methods from cultural studies, sociology, history, and others. Across all of those research domains, narratives have a few core characteristics. Narratives or stories unfold over time through a series of key events. So when we think about a story, we're highlighting events, scenes, and themes. Narratives do not simply describe what happened in the past, but are active in shaping our perception of the facts of past events. Narratives help us to make sense of the past, our present and future, and the links between them. And narratives also have a plot, right? It not only describes the events that occur, but also provides an interpretation of each part of the story. So in the book, I use narrative research methods from various interdisciplinary lenses, along with critical theories. And I do this to dismantle the more dominant and singularly focused ideas about philanthropy, civil society, and social change. Next slide, please. So the book, as I mentioned, covers three narrative contexts: historical narratives, arts narratives, and lived experience narratives. So I'll go through each of these, but I'll start with historical narratives. So as I assessed historical narratives, I've concentrated on the periods in history of enslavement, colonization, as well as some of the events that occurred during decolonization. A set of key questions I employed as I analyzed philanthropy from below through Bahamian historical narratives include: what are the glimpses, frames, and stories of Bahamian civil society leadership during these periods? And what do these stories suggest about the local environment of civil society in the Bahamas? So I used quite a few sources, including traditional and non-traditional archives. I took a look at speeches, newspaper articles, organizational narratives, as well as biographies. Next slide, please. So in a chapter that's entitled Submarine Narratives, I spent some time thinking about historical narratives through the lens of philanthropy from below as these narratives emerge from a transnational, meaning across borders, inclusive of the Caribbean and the Bahamian experience. I think most of us know that Black people's experiences in oppressive contexts have always drove migration. And through migration, over time, these people have built what scholars call transnational bonds or valuable relationships across borders. In this chapter, I wanted to assess how Bahamians and their ties to civil society at home and abroad shape our contemporary conceptual understanding of civil society formation within the Caribbean and diaspora. So first, I spent some time analyzing the ethnographic and creative projects of famed writer and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston. In particular, I thought and worked around her time spent in the Bahamas and with Bahamians. So during the time that Zora visited the Bahamas in the early 20th century, the Bahamas was one of the poor British colonial holdings. It lacked a robust plantation economy and also had a racially oppressive system. Because of this, many Bahamians took to the sea and often migrated to South Florida to earn higher wages. After her time in Miami's Liberty City, I think most Bahamians know that community, Hurston learned about something that Bahamians call the fire dance. And you see a picture of the fire dance pictured below. Hurston visited the Bahamas twice to document the dance, where she also collected songs and information about the dances. During this time, she also experienced a terrible hurricane, which played a significant role in the culmination of her most notable novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Later that year, she published her findings of the fire dance in the Journal of American Folklore in an article titled Dance, Songs, and Tales of the Bahamas. When I read her accounts, I could tell that Zora fell in love with the songs that Bahamians wrote. And she noted, anything you do, Bahamians put you in a sing. And she also mentioned that she did her best to avoid being put in a sing. When you take a look at the songs, they range from critical to mundane themes. But I want to think about how the songs and dances provide a lens on community empowerment of that time. Putting your enemy in a sing did numerous things. It announced and described a kind of leadership. It promoted a side. It denounced another perspective. It explained and educated others about a political or social situation. And it highlighted people's perspectives on appropriate leadership. Hurston also described the fire dance as a quote, exceedingly African folk dance. She also noted that it was mostly working class participants who typically engaged in the practice. She noted every evening, no matter how arduous the workday had been, these participants performed during the workday and with the setting of the sun. For me, the fire dance highlights a form of creative and collective work. The sings and the fire dance pinpoint communal forms of public and community expression. Those who were relegated to a lower status found the opportunity to express and reckoned with what they had observed within political and social life. They used these musical forms to assert their values and their political and social preferences. The rhythms, the harmonies, and the lyrics turn these dances and songs into what I would say is a civic practice. Participants use these musical and performative opportunities to work out social problems, critique actions such as racial and other forms of social oppression, and renewed their sense of self-determination in a brutal landscape. Next slide, please. In the chapter, I also draw on insights from writer and activist James Weldon Johnson and his perspectives on leadership and activism, which he developed, I suggest, based on his Bahamian and Circum-Caribbean ancestry. James Weldon Johnson grew up in Florida, but he also had strong ties to the Bahamas. And in his autobiography, Along This Way, he traces his complex genealogy, which traverses the Circum-Caribbean and the Atlantic world from about the 18th and up until the early 20th century. Today, Johnson is heralded as an African American man of letters, distinguished in his political, civic, and artistic service. His autobiography's description of his formative life experiences and lineage are integral for locating the wellspring of knowledge that shaped his leadership aspirations and success. From his autobiography and his other work, his Bahamian and Caribbean roots loomed large and were very formative for him. First, Johnson's use of family stories revealed his perspectives on Black leadership, focused on institution building. Johnson's mother, Helen Louise Dillett, was born in 1842 to Stephen Dillett and Mary Simonet. Stephen, Johnson's grandfather, came to the Bahamas by way of Haiti as a young boy. Little Stephen, though, through a mix of luck and innate talent, eventually became a formidable political, social, and civic leader in early Bahamian society. We know that Dillett apprenticed as a tailor and became the first Black Bahamian to win a seat in the House of Assembly. And he also served in a host of other leadership capacities that shed light on early foundational civil society practices of Black and mixed race Bahamians. James Weldon Johnson's grandfather, Stephen Dillett, is recognized as one of the owners, and you see a picture here, of Balcony House, built around 1788 and currently restored as a museum. Dillett lived in the house during the mid-1880s, eventually sold it, and it went on to become a historical monument. Dillett's ongoing recognition is embodied in the built environment, I suggest, the Balcony House, and I argue that it's a powerful site of memory for remembering and thinking of philanthropy from below. Additionally, as Johnson goes on as a leader for the NAACP, serving in the American Foreign Diplomatic Corps and his creative work, his Haitian Bahamian roots, passed on through family stories, were helpful and informative to him in numerous ways. They connected him to his diasporic roots, provided context to his family's leadership, mainly around institution building, focused on racial inclusion, indigenous leadership, and collaborative networks. And so here we see the importance of Bahamian historical narratives, but the ways in which they exist across national borders. Next slide, please. I then turned my attention to historical narratives that explain how philanthropy from below developed over time, and in particular up until the late to mid 20th century within the Bahamas. The questions here I considered: what are the historical narratives of Bahamian society in this period, and what are the frames and stories of Bahamian philanthropy from below? What can we learn from these stories of philanthropy from below for understanding the past, our present, as well as the future? And so I have a few images here. Many Bahamians, Black in particular, had limited rights and opportunities, but the dominant narratives of their experience was that the Bahamas was an idyllic place for would-be visitors, ready to receive them as hosts for the purpose of their pleasure and leisure, and also open for business. Here you see some images of Bahamians in these tourist brochures depicted as happy, or police officers serving as faceless protectors to visitors. I also wanted to show, and you see those over to the right, some of the images of fundraising soirees focused on the very wealthy in Bahamian society who had means for leisure and philanthropy. Next slide, please. However, on the other side of town, Bahamians over time recognized their social limitations and engaged in repertoires and practices to support themselves. I'm sorry, can you? Yeah, here we go. These included friendly societies, mutual aid organizations, and burial associations. Those types of institutions offered forms of community agency and collective support. They created social and cultural uplift organizations, social welfare organizations. You see the women, Mother Butler pictured here. Economic empowerment organizations, religious orders and groups which offered liberation in both spiritual and material terms. They worked within what some scholars call the performative commons, where they developed the arts as a social practice. They led and created social movements, did advocacy work, led labor movements, which eventually led to the formation of political parties. They engaged in the press, which provided a written record, offering a voice to the struggle while proposing strategies for empowerment. I also described the role that riots, spontaneous protests, uprisings, and revolts played in offering cognitive and emotional liberation, as well as collective redress for perceived wrongs. Evident in these repertoires and practices of philanthropy from below, you see a few key themes. First, you understand the role of transnationalism, the way in which folks who had to migrate learned and shared tactics and strategies of philanthropy from below across borders. You see rich networks of associations from the churches to the lodge to the women's groups to the press in between these organizational activities. At the core of all of this work was the pursuit of equitable citizenship and a desire for belonging. The range of activism took many forms, from public to private, formal to informal, spontaneous to planned. And as you link these activities, you understand the role of cultural identity and the recognition of intersectional social identities, race, gender, and class, shaping and forming the work that's happening within these groups. You also see important bridging activities across race and class groups. Ultimately, what you see with these historical narratives is a philanthropic practice, often from below, that engaged in redress and resistance while also promoting holistic care for community members. Next slide, please. Okay, so the second lens of narrative analysis explains the unfolding of philanthropy from below, but through the arts. And I suggest that it's impossible to understand Caribbean democratic participation, belonging, community engagement, and social change without recognizing the importance of Caribbean artistic expression in shaping these goals. Just as Zora Neale Hurston described the fire dances and sings depicted in the archives, Junkanoo parades, rake and scrape music, and the cadre of small but mighty contemporary artists have received both local and global acclaim while also reflecting important Bahamian community formations. Bahamian music and other art forms have deep connections to civil society formation. Focusing on the period of decolonization and into the more contemporary post-colonial period, I asked the question, how did art narratives promote and support civil society formation? Of course, I took a look at a lot of arts, including text performances from a range of genres, literature, music, architecture, visual art, and biographies. Next slide, please. In fact, the arts gave me the initial impetus for the book after I had attended a Junkanoo performance on either it was Boxing Day or New Year's Day. And I hope most people know what Junkanoo is in the audience, but I'll explain. Junkanoo is known today as the National Cultural Festival of the Bahamas. Dates back to the beginning of the 19th century. It was brought to the Bahamas by enslaved Africans who used their 3-day holiday to recreate festivals from home. So I was at a Junkanoo parade, I think in 2013 or so, in the early morning outside in the crisp air, where I recognized for the first time the sound of Junkanoo, its dazzle and spectacle, provided insight into the Bahamian people's civic, participatory, and collective aspirations. I can remember that one of the larger groups was performing on Bay Street and was at the height of its performance. If you ever go to a parade, to begin the banner passes, and then you have dazzling costumes and dancers, and then you have the music. The song played by the Junkanoo Group was entitled Get Involved, which you now know is the title of the book. The song originally was recorded in 1982 by Tyrone Fitzgerald, otherwise known as Dr. Off. And in the song, he describes one vision of the good society, proposing multiple forms of community action, getting a good education, participating in your neighborhood, and intergenerational care. When I observed the crowd singing to Dr. Off's song, I saw young and old, men and women, Black and others, tourists and residents all participating. The songs, the lyrics, or the melody seemed recognizable to most of the people here. There. The crowd's recognition of Dr. Off's song helped me realize that Junkanoo is a cultural practice that not only brings people together in the present moment, but joins performers and spectators in an act of memorialization. This Junkanoo rendition of Get Involved, built on a memory of an old tune created in the early years of the nation's independence, connected to a more contemporary movement, right? The Junkanoo Parade then served as a place to express community memory, belonging, and action. In the early post colonial days, arts and culture in the Bahamas helped define and solidify national identity. Artists and art practices work to identify the questions such as who are we, where do we come from, and what are our roots? Next slide, please. Observed over multiple art genres, including architecture, visual arts, literary arts, the performing arts, you see artists working alongside government to answer those questions, but they also protest new policies that they did not agree with. In the post-colonial period, Bahamians were interested in new questions about social identity, inclusion, and political critique, and artists were at the vanguard of responding to those questions. And you see to the left, to the bottom left, the image from the book done by Brent Malone, Junkanoo Celebration. I see Marian Bethel is here, and I have her poetry collection, Guanahani My Love, that does some of that work of answering those questions, as well as other artists depicted below. Next slide, please. So the final narrative lens I used to understand philanthropy from below focused on contemporary experiences. And by that, I mean the lived experience of current civil society leaders. My questions here were included, how do civil society leaders understand their work within a post-colonial context of Bahamian society? How do they think of the past work of civil society as a way to propel their leadership? And what role does cultural identity shape in their work as they support communities? Here, I interviewed over 30 civil society leaders. And in my interviews, I spent time understanding their life histories, their appreciation for cultural identity, as well as how they worked within their communities to create social change. Next slide, please. In what I describe as a post-colonial moment, which is the contemporary moment, for the Bahamas, its transition into a newly independent nation came with several challenges. Over time, some social changes occurred due to some major moments, including the drug wars and other social problems. And these all had a great impact on Bahamian society. But when you think of these challenges, you can also think about the newly created freedoms by the state that produced new opportunities for social, political, and civic participation. And so by this time period, contemporary civil society leaders are thinking about all of these issues, the challenges and the opportunities to participate. And what they're doing is that they're embodying narratives of resilience. They tell stories of resilience as they carry on the values and organizational patterns of the past while grappling with new and persisting problems. Next slide, please. Here are some things that we learned from these leaders. They embody the past of civil society's history and continue to harness their philanthropic imagination in three ways. First, they have a strong understanding of space and place. Here, civil society leaders reckon with the question of how does space and place help us in our work define what we mean by community and community advancement. And so I have a quote posted here under there. It's one comment by an arts leader who had hopes to revitalize what is known as an over-the-hill community. And again, all Bahamians will know what that is. These are communities from the period of emancipation into the colonial era where lower to middle income Black people lived. But as independence occurred, many moved away, right, to the suburbs. Here's the quote from the leader. They say, I would love to have sufficient capital to create, to build a community from scratch, or to revitalize a community. I'd love to be given responsibility, say for maybe 4 square blocks right over the hill, and just give it to me and let me take that area and create a model community, neighborhood in that part of town, a neighborhood that people must visit when they come, end quote. Here, the leader is describing a proposed community center program which depicts a narrative of the themes of leave and return. It highlights how an evolving middle class eventually moved out of the inner city. The proposed project of the quoted civil society leader identifies a few critical realities. The leader's interest in community revitalization of the space has significant historical meaning and is one that contemporary middle class leaders believe needs support. The leader's interest in developing a site of community revitalization in an over the hill area aims to preserve a crucial space of development of Bahamian cultural identity. Other interviewees shared similar concerns and interests. While they lamented the loss of close community connections from their pasts, they also wished to support these communities through their civil society work, aiming to provide those left behind residents, quote unquote, with tools for perceived success and community improvement. Here you see the pull and push related to the themes of leave and return, which undoubtedly shape the post colonial experience, but also shape the ways in which contemporary civil society leaders worked. Civil society leaders also considered the role of power relations. In their work, they asked the question, what do we do with civil society when it is believed by many people that they do not hold sufficient power? Across the interviewees, civil society leaders recognize the critical role of power relations. These leaders recognize the growing challenges of inequality and further deepening class divisions. Inequality stems from issues related to rising levels of unemployment, crime, and violence, as well as government inaction. These issues across all interviews were ever present in the minds of these interviewed leaders. Interviewees also highlighted public sector action or inaction that either facilitates social change or actually leads to social problems. Even more so, they recognize how the government interacted positively and negatively with their civil society activities. And here I have a quote below that describes the experience of one civil society leader who tried to register with the new legal requirement for nonprofit registration. Here they say it took us well over a year to get registered. And then when we finally got the papers back, which was sometime like in April, the attorney general had like signed off on them in like December. So it took them 4 months to tell us. And God forbid that piece of paper got lost somewhere, right? End quote. So, as the new commitment to regulate nonprofits strove to bring greater transparency to civil society, the process for local civil society organizations at this moment proved strenuous and challenging. I think it's important to consider how civil society leaders understand their relationship with government and their perception of public sector roadblocks to their work. Leaders recognize these power differentials, like trying to register their nonprofits and the challenges they experienced, but it was also important to note that they identified workarounds, ways to negotiate and address these challenges through various forms of advocacy. Third, civil society leaders continue to understand their identity, asking the question, who are we within the Bahamas and Bahamian civil society? The social identities of race, gender, and class also impact how civil society operates in the country. First, these identities are linked, and for civil society leaders, these identities guide their understanding of themselves in connection with their work, their leadership, and their work. Their awareness of race, class, and gender also guides their approaches to addressing societal issues. Here's another leader who discussed the role of these identities shaping society and how they use that understanding to guide their work. The quote says, okay, I don't think we can talk about class without talking about race. Especially in the Bahamas, you have the intersection of class and race that is almost indistinguishable. For civil society leaders, race continues to play a factor in society, and the distinctions and the intersection of race, class, and gender are not only rooted in historical context, but strike at current divisions in society. Awareness of these realities shaped their leadership and organizational practices. Next slide, please. In listening to these leaders, I recognize that they embody narratives of resilience, which is not only to say that they are strong with limited means, which sometimes we end up thinking that's all resilience is, but I also wanted to think about how they understood their challenges and limitations while still exhibiting capacities of care and innovative strategies. These leaders maintain a deep knowledge of the political process based on their multiple experiences and use this knowledge to craft relevant strategies. The leaders exhibit an abiding care of neglected communities that emerge from narratives of belonging, typically tied to different forms of cultural identity. They engage in a relentless pursuit of options and avenues for success. And they provide critical insight on the significance of their civic responsibility, along with their awareness of social identities such as class, gender, and race. Next slide, please. So, across these three narrative domains of history, art, and lived experience, we have some important takeaways. First, this kind of analysis signifies the importance of understanding how race, gender, and class shape society. It's also important to link and consider how colonial histories and legacies shape current post colonial formations and challenges. The work showcases how we can think about broadening the definitions of philanthropy, civil society, to include understudy groups, practices, and their repertoires. We know, based on this study, that social hierarchy is shaped the range of philanthropic impulses and the values that emerge from those impulses. What we also see that in the Caribbean and the global South, civil society leaders are resilient and creative amidst post-colonial challenges. And you see this even throughout history. Next slide, please. So, four major takeaways for the book. The case of the Caribbean, and specifically in the case of the Bahamas, showed that there are varied philanthropic impulses, and those impulses are based on a particular group's relationship to democracy, their historical levels of inclusion, and their ability to act with agency to achieve their philanthropic imagination. Tracing cultural identity is significant, as observed in the case of the Bahamas. It's apparent that the development and realization of civil society for historically marginalized groups emerge from the experience of oppression. These groups engage in repertoires and practices that assert their humanity and establish patterns of survival and resistance while making continuous claims for inclusion and equality. Tracing these kinds of histories and community formations of these marginalized groups require broadening our understanding of what we mean when we say philanthropy and civil society. And it is vital to assess how experiences of historically marginalized group cultivate alternative practices from below. So when completing the book, I want to end here. It takes time first to do this research, then you go through the review process, and then you wait for the book to go to press. It's a really arduous process. You can't anticipate when the work finally sees the light of day. Yet I'm thrilled to think about Get Involved's entry into the world at a time when these kinds of lessons and activities that shape citizenship and the moral and imagination seem needed more than ever. If you have any takeaways from the talk today, it's that the blueprint for cultivating inclusion and belonging, fairness and justice, and the good society is potentially located in the pages of this book, amongst many other powerful works. Additionally, folks who care about the principles, and I hope we all care about these principles today, would do ourselves well to seek these ideas out, learn from the past, and read avidly and widely from places close to us, as well as those seemingly distant, but in many ways that still resonate with us. So I'll end there, and thank you for your time. Look forward to your questions.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so, so much. I am going to make sure, I was told by one of our wonderful folks that my camera needed to be repositioned. So for those of you on here, I got a new computer yesterday and I'm just getting used to it. So, well, first of all, Kim, thank you. That was really, really beautiful. And I loved learning and I loved all of the connections that you made. And thank you for also talking about your method and being very gracious about just the way we do research and the patience we need and all of those things and the care too. So we have lots and lots of questions. So I hope you're ready.
Yeah.
We have 15 minutes to, so we have lots of time for discussion. Well, the first one is, from Alexandra, you seem to have interviewed many people, especially historians. Did you interview anyone involved on the front line of philanthropy?
Yeah, well, thank you for your question, Alexandra. Good to uh not see you, but see your question. Yeah, so when I talk about the historical narratives, I didn't interview historians, but I did spend a lot of time in the archives, so the more traditional archives at the National Archives, but also what's important in doing this work. Oftentimes the archives about people who are marginalized in the discourse on philanthropy. The archives are problematic, right? And so there's some strategies that we use to work around the archives, but we also spend time as historians trying to create new archives, right? So I always tell Bahamians, you have tons and tons of archives in your home. Your family pictures and your family stories are quite important. And so I used those traditional archives as well as those alternative and new archives to think about the historical analysis. But in the case of people on the front lines, I actually did. I spent and I feel like I'm still spending time learning and listening to over 30 current civil society leaders. And these folks came from across various different subsectors of the nonprofit or the third sector world, from the arts to social welfare to youth development to community engagement, and spend time understanding their stories. So when you see me provide the quotes to those leaders, that's where that data is coming from. So thank you.
Thank you for that answer too. Okay, here's another one. This one's anonymous, but thank you for your excellent insight and research. I'm interested in this new term you've coined, philanthropy from below, and this idea of narrative being essential to this practice. However, when shaping policy for these nations deriving from philanthropic efforts, do you believe narrative enough to promote long-standing change within these communities?
Mm. That's a really
Big
good
question.
question. I've been thinking about this quite a bit. And I don't know, Mary Beth, if you've seen this in your work in philanthropy, but one of the big conversations right now is the role of narrative change.
Mhm.
And the importance of beginning first with narrative change, meaning sometimes the way that we think about the world and we perceive the world, we're functioning within a certain type of narrative. And sometimes those narratives may be damaging or limiting. And so, this idea of narrative change offers an opportunity for us to think anew about who we are, our histories, and our experiences. And so I hear your question about, is it enough? Is it sufficient? Potentially not, but I do think it's an important first place to begin for us to understand, in the case of the Bahamas and the Caribbean, our longstanding history in social change, the ways that we have always had to be clever and innovative, and thinking about how those experiences, which I think many young people may or may not know those experiences, what that information would do in changing the narrative about the possibilities we have as citizens and the opportunities we have to create and make social change. So I guess what I'm trying to say, in many ways, narrative change is potentially the first place, but it's a really important and critical place to begin.
Yeah, I that particular point that you were making really resonated with me too, because when I was a younger historian, I spent a lot of time trying to do something similar, which is change the narrative around what philanthropy is, right? Because we picture philanthropy, unfortunately, as oftentimes people picture it as older white men, or white men in general, when I was doing research related to African American philanthropy, I had a lot of people tell me, well, that's not a thing, right? That's not a thing, and it's such a thing. So I mean,
Mhm.
there's so much history and of just Black philanthropy in general. So that what you were talking about there really resonated with me, yeah, in my research too. Okay, here's another one from Imani. Thank you, Dr. Williams-Pulfer, for this presentation. Oh, this is interesting. How do remittances or other forms of philanthropy bear fruit today across the Bahamian diaspora on the island and abroad? That's interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a great question. Thank you, Imani. Good to see your question. Yeah, I think remittances is definitely one of those lesser known opportunities to think about philanthropy from below, especially when we talk about these transnational links, right? So folks are not only sharing ideas across borders, but they're also sharing funding across borders. And I think, scholars like yourself, up and coming scholars, it would be great to spend more time to think about these remittance flows. I know there's been work done in the past on this, but it would be particularly important, especially at this time, right, to think about how those flows of dollars are actually supporting families and communities in ways that sit outside of traditional philanthropy.
Thank you. All right, here's a question from Lori, who is one of my former students, by the way, from years ago.
Mm,
She said, excellent presentation. Thank you. I greatly appreciate the methodology used. Would you
mm,
recommend using the same methodology to promote philanthropy in higher ed in this politically charged
mm.
environment?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that question. That's the politically charged environment is a difficult one. I think, especially, I don't know how you feel about this, Mary Beth. I think we're still learning what this moment actually means for folks doing research. Um, but
Yeah,
I say I stand on business when I say I think this narrative work and narrative change is particularly important. And I think you mentioned this idea of what's happening in higher ed. And I've seen a lot of voices saying that we need to double down on the importance of higher ed. And I know that's what we do here at the Proctor Institute. So, yeah, I think narrative change and narrative methods would be particularly important to demonstrate the impact of the use of philanthropy and its deep need within in the higher ed space.
thank you. Well, we have lots more questions. I love these warm comments for you. Pamela says, congratulations, Kim. And I love this question too. What were the challenges you faced in gathering your research? That's always something that researchers want to know, right?
Absolutely. Well, great to see Pamela. Pamela is in London, so she's tuning in from a bit far away. Great to see your question. The challenges I think come back to this point of the archive, right? So what's available and what are you seeing? And sometimes what you're seeing, you have to engage in those strategies of reading around the archive, like trying to understand how the silences that are existing in the archive, what they are saying to you, right? So, there's a well-known story of a enslaved woman, Kate, in the Bahamas, and I use her as an example because the archive currently, describes how she was beaten by her owners, and we know very little about her. But I think scholars try to read around that literature and think, or that archive and think, well, what did she do to get to that point? What potentially was she doing to resist her enslavement? And so that was one of the issues. The other issue, I think, trying to work across those narrative spaces, it's pretty unwieldy, right? So I have tons and tons of files and spaces because I'm thinking about the archive and I'm thinking about current civil society leaders. And the way I worked around those challenges is a good friend told me, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so that would be my encouragement. I think having a range of examples is really critical to make the case for these types of questions, especially when folks go like, well, that's not philanthropy. And I don't understand what you're talking about. And so commitment to time, to really unpacking a variety of sources, I think is critical.
Thank you. Thank you. Here's another great one from Marion. What was the impact or role of gender in your research?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Glad you're here, Marion. I mentioned to everybody, Marion wrote that beautiful collection of poetry that I source quite well. So I guess I can use Marion's example. I used a few of her poems, and the poems. I'm thinking of one in particular where she talked about, or she described her grandmother saying to her, when are you coming back home? And it's such a beautiful rendition of this intergenerational care, intergenerational learning between women. And I took it to mean in the poem that Marian's grandmother was urging her to come back and serve her country and come be a part of the Bahamian experiment. And so gender plays a significant role in the work, right? From the theorists who are helping us understand how philanthropy is playing out in underrepresented spaces. Oftentimes it's the women who are doing the labor. And so spending a lot of time with those social welfare organizations. Marion has done a great film about the women's suffrage movement in the Bahamas. And there's this powerful line that one of the leaders makes, the women were out protesting while they were also cooking the food, So just to think about the range of care and love and commitment that women, and we're speaking about gender, um, commit to the practices of philanthropy from below, but also many ways in which they are under-recognized or undervalued in that work. So yeah, so gender is very important, and the role of women in particular is quite important to my analysis.
All right, thank you. I am going to try to squeak in two more questions,
Mhm.
because you are very good at answering in a very succinct way. So, this is an interesting question too from Alexandra. Can you give us some examples of how people are marginalized through philanthropy?
Mm. Well, I think one big marginalization point, and so we're thinking about philanthropy in the more dominant form, right? The big funding, and what I found, and this continues to be the case in terms of the data that the Caribbean region itself is oftentimes left out of important philanthropic, big money philanthropy conversations. So this is a very clear example of how some of the nonprofits and third sector organizations I worked with in the Bahamas and elsewhere. I see other people on the call from different places in the Caribbean have great programs, great opportunities for funding, and somehow the space as of the Caribbean itself is marginalized in those more dominant conversations. So yeah, that's definitely one example, and hopefully this work is an attempt to help big funders continue to see the value and importance of the space of the Caribbean and be able to turn their attention to support the work going on.
Thank you. Okay, so I got one last question.
Okay,
And also I just want to say this is so exciting. You have so many people from all different countries on here.
it's
It's really
wonderful.
lovely. So, okay, this is from Imani again. What are your hopes for philanthropy from below and its influence on the sector at large, but especially given the drastic changes in the US and foreign aid? That is a really important question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Imani. And I know there's some folks on the call from the Bahamas who've experienced some of that. Some of those changes as it relates to foreign aid. I think, we're still trying to figure that out. But what I think this idea of philanthropy from below, this is why I said I think it's particularly important at this moment. I just heard a quote from Prime Minister Brave Davis, the Bahamian Prime Minister. I think he was speaking at some Caribbean event, and he said something like, "Uncertainty is not necessarily a bad thing." And when I heard that, I thought about the folks, especially in the historical section of the book, who definitely lived in uncertain and precarious times, and yet they were able to find creative opportunities to express their philanthropic imaginations. And so I think those lessons from the past are particularly important, especially in this moment where the whole funding infrastructure appears to be changing right before our very eyes. And so I hope some of the strategies here listed here are helpful and useful for the moment.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you being hopeful and positive and reminding us of like the power and influence that we can have,
Mm,
just everyday people can have, which is really important.
absolutely.
And just want to say thank you so much for a great talk. The questions were incredible, great audience. Thank you to the audience as well. Also, always want to say thank you to Giselle and Jacinda, who are behind the scenes, but always doing a ton, and I like to recognize them. This was sponsored by the Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice. I want to stress those words. They're really important, and I hope that you'll join us for some future talks. And we will send out a version of this video and also the book code and a link to the book. You'll get that in a couple of days. And so, again, Kim, thank you so much. Just absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Bye, everybody.